I'm curious. We talk about that athlete identity. I think that, I mean, we certainly, on one hand, we see the, the results at the end of careers where athletes have to transition into quote unquote civilian life. And that can be really challenging. And I mean, I think just the statistics around like the divorce rate and mental health issues, et cetera, are there. But I look at it, I've got a 7-year-old, and he really loves sports. And if you asked him, he would say like, "I'm a hockey player," but he also loves art. He loves being in nature and playing and all these things. And so he's a little boy. He's a little boy. I sense that there's a lot of little boys and little girls out there that at a very young age, for a lot of good reasons, develop a passion for a sport, and that's how they start to identify as a person. And on one hand, we want to support that. I know my wife and I talk about it often. That how do we support him, but find that balance, because we operate on the assumption that he's never going to get a scholarship or ever get a paycheck for playing sports. This is fun, but it's a fine line. But so my question is like, how do we, as coaches, as the adults in the room, how do we ensure that young people have a healthy relationship with sport without it becoming their identity?
It's an awesome point. And I think how you and your wife are approaching that is really spot on. It's actually a big piece of the book that we're releasing in June 16th, Intentional Attention. And in that book, we talk about athletic identity, or just identity, and how that impacts our wellness and ultimately our performance. I've worked with a lot of NFL quarterbacks over my career that played quarterback myself. And so I've worked with a lot of them. What's so fascinating about it is they all identify first, I'm a quarterback. That's who I am. Yeah. That's what I do. And what's so interesting, if we identify solely as the athlete, as the quarterback, when that performance drops, the human brain associates that with, I am now ceasing to exist. So if this is who I am, and that is not going well or not good or potentially failing, I'm done. And so the subconscious brain really starts to rev that up in terms of anxiety, in terms of fear, in terms of, and it starts to really drive a lot of subconscious attention towards results. And what that ends up doing is it gets people caught in this threat loop that is not healthy. And we call it the threat response. And it's really a mechanism that is just there to protect us as human beings. The brain is trying to protect us from a fall out of that identity. But the way we can develop, or the way we can get through this proactively, is, I think, what you and your wife are thinking about is, how do we find a balance? And I was working with an Olympic swimmer a number of years ago, and this topic came up. He was bringing up his identity. He's like, "No, I'm a swimmer," and I was like, "That's great," and I love that you're swimming and you identify as that. But he was living and dying after every race. And as he reported, he said, I actually found just relief when I did what I thought I could do. And then everything else was just horrific. So it was just relief. There was no more joy in it anymore. But I said, well, what about developing other identities? How do we want to start to add more? It's not taking away that identity, but I can be both a swimmer and I can be a father. I could be a partner. I could be a brother. I could be a friend. I can be a good person. I can be, there's so many things we can start to identify as. And he said, well, if I don't put all my eggs in this basket, I'm not going to be my best. And that was what we had to come up and start to say, is that true? And as he started to work through that, he started to say, holy crap, that is the most false statement he could have made, because it was not putting his eggs in a basket. Working more or thinking about it more or actually had a detrimental effect to his performance.